Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion. We have under 48 hours left to stop Starmageddon. That's what's been going around on Twitter today. The Conservatives have released another advert focusing on what Labour will do to your taxes, what they'll do to your national security. But in today's episode, we want to examine from a Christian point of view what will Labour do to the moral and spiritual state of this land. And in particular, we're looking at this in the light of the fact that if the Evangelical Alliance research is reliable, more than 40% of evangelical Christians are lining up to vote Labour. Indeed, a greater proportion of evangelicals are set to vote Labour than in the population at large. So if any party is winning the evangelical vote, and admittedly it's quite a spread, but if any party is winning the evangelical vote, it is set to be Labour. Now, we're going to be looking at this and hopefully bringing the light of God's word to bear on it, examining these the claims that this is compatible with a Christian worldview and with Christian values. But before we take a dive into what Labour are saying of themselves and what they're promising and so on, I'm going to bring Tim in. Tim, thanks for joining me once again. And I wonder, Tim, if you can help us first off think through what is it that people do see, evangelicals, what is it they do see in Labour? We're going to be, just to lay our cards on the table, we're going to be pushing back against this trajectory of evangelicals voting for Labour. We don't think that's the way we're meant to go. But there are many sincere Christians who clearly think it is the way to go. So Tim, help us out. What is it that people are seeing in Labour? Indeed, many perhaps listening in to this episode, what are they seeing in Labour? Why are Christians attracted to this party at this time?
Hi, Dave, and hello, everybody. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think the research you alluded to, that this EA thing is really fascinating in the picture it presents. And I think time and again, certain things come up. So you mentioned 42% of folks, evangelicals, I should say, saying that they would vote for Labour at the next election, which was slightly higher than the general population. But even bigger than that figure was 58% of these evangelicals who were surveyed. One of the things they said that their key thing, really, in terms of dictating who they would vote for on July the 4th, is this idea of helping those most in need. Helping those most
Mm.
in need. This is the kind of catch-all that would determine their vote, their political allegiance, which I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing to say. I don't think it's the totality of what should determine our vote. And one of the things I found quite funny in that survey, this podcast is not funny at all, but one of the things I found quite amusing was that there, there was a certain percentage that voted that said one of the things that they determined their voting pattern was uh, biblical principles, and it was kind of less than 100%. And you think, well, if these are evangelical Christians, shouldn't it be 100% saying, that helps them in their choices? But so there's other things I think we should think about when we're voting, but maybe God's design for society, for example, maybe religious freedoms, maybe how easy it is to share the gospel and promote the cause of Christ. But actually helping those in need is not a bad summary, is it? Of
Mm.
certainly our obligation to our neighbour. And if you interpret that very holistically in terms of helping those in need being also about evangelism, then actually it covers a great deal. But one might think of the parable of Good Samaritan. What is that man doing but helping the man in need? And so I think actually that's what these evangelical Labour voters or potential Labour voters kind of what they're doing is they're kind of they're lumping those two things together. They're saying, well,
Mm.
what I want to do with my vote is I want to help those in need, and for whatever reason, the best way to help those in need is to vote Labour. Um, so I think it's that kind of narrative. So these are not people necessarily who would be, Guardian subscribers, or they might not sort of tick some of the other boxes we might associate with some of the more fringe positions, or ideological positions, shall we say, of the Labour Party. But they think that voting for the Labour Party is the best way to help those in need, particularly the best way to help the vulnerable. So we're thinking about the poor, we're thinking about those who are marginalised in other ways. Possibly folks are thinking about asylum seekers, those seeking asylum in this country. Um, Possibly they're thinking about people living on the edges of our large cities and council estates, seemingly with little sort of future prospects. But in all these situations, they think that a vote for Labour is a vote for these people, for these marginalised groups. It's a vote for justice. Maybe it's also a vote for levelling up. I think we've seen the sort of Tory slogans there become a little bit hollow with this whole kind of levelling up agenda. And um, so, so I think, Dave, that's what people are thinking about. I
Mm,
don't think they're looking at this in great granular detail. I think that's important. I
mm,
think this is a bit like the way the culture's gone. It's gone snapshot, it's gone soundbite, it's gone, yeah, helping those in need. That sounds good. That sounds Christian. And to an extent,
mm,
yes. But then to work through the implications of that, when one gets into policy, when one gets into the kind of ideological commitments that buttress the Labour Party in its current iteration, you see, well, what on earth does this really look like in detail? And I think
mm,
we're going to see as we go on that it isn't simply that. But you know, in my own conversations, when you get onto issues of politics, and particularly when you bring up the issue of abortion, when you say, well, tinkering with tax brackets, tinkering with how many hours of childcare, these are not insignificant things. But when you bring them into this, when you bring them in, when you compare them rather against abortion, you see, well, these doesn't
mm,
doesn't kind of remotely stack up when you're talking about decisions of life and death about a child's life in the womb. And when you scale that up to the 250,000 children that we know were killed in that fashion in 2022, how on earth can one see the two as comparable? I mean, I certainly can't. But then the response to this is then, well, yes, but okay, Labour are going to invest more in the NHS. They're going to invest more in, early start, foundation education, all the rest of it. They're going to invest more in sort of demographics in society that are struggling at the moment the most, and perhaps deciding on economic grounds to have abortions to end their child's life. So actually, seen in this kind of way, a vote for Labour is somehow also a vote against abortion, because if people, particularly from that lowest economic bracket, are kind of drawn out of that economic situation, they will be less inclined to abort their child. It's a pretty roundabout, and I'd say
mm,
fairly perverse argument as well. But that is nonetheless the argument,
mm,
one of the arguments that I've encountered. Um, and of course, we're coming also, Dave, out of several years of, you know, economic recession or whatever, cost of living crisis, which of course followed on from COVID, or sort of ran parallel with COVID. And so cost of living, I think, is a lot in people's minds, the economy, the amount of money they have to spend. And I heard just today Keir Starmer reiterating that point, that under Labour, people will have more disposable income. Listen, I'm not sure that's correct, but that's the message he's putting out there. But just on this cost of living crisis, which is a phrase we hear bandied around actually by all the main parties, I would say that the far bigger cost of living crisis is the one I've already mentioned, that involves 250,000 couples in the UK every year deciding the cost of their child living is not worth it. And
mm,
that may be occasionally for economic reasons, but it will certainly be for a lot broader range of reasons than economics. That the life of their child is itself a crisis, prompting a
mm,
judgment to end that child's life. And actually, on this issue, Dave, Labour has nothing to say to this
mm,
crisis other than to encourage, aid, and abet it.
mm,
So, whatever Labour talks about justice and equality and fairness and serving society, I would suggest there is a massive justice blind spot on this issue of abortion. And that's not unique to Labour, but certainly Labour are doing nothing to address that. And in none of their policies, none of their none of their vision for the future is that going to be addressed. If anything, it's going to get worse, and we're going to see potentially how that could get worse. How have we got to that situation? I mean, that's the subject of a podcast in itself, but I think, as we've touched on many times, the narrative has become so warped. Abortion is often rarely even couched in terms of ethical or moral decisions. It's often seen as healthcare, pure and simple. And so,
Mm,
of course, access to healthcare, who would disagree with access to healthcare? Who would want to judge people for accessing healthcare? So, again, when the issue is couched in those terms, you can see how people could be persuaded to believe that somehow abortion and access to abortion is part of that justice agenda. It's not. It's never purely healthcare. It's not like having your tonsils removed, having an appendix out. It's a decision with weighty consequences that linger often a long time after the procedure itself. Or it's couched, the other classic way it's couched is in terms of a women's issue. It's the last frontier that needs liberating from patriarchy, from male expectation about women's bodies and their reproductive potential. It's the sort of handmaid's tale syndrome, if you like. So this is much more seeing abortion in terms of kind of ideological um, gender issues sort of thing,
mm,
gender justice. But abortion is not my body, my choice. At least
mm,
two bodies are always involved, more in the case of multiple pregnancies. And the child itself, of course, is a result of two bodies, not just the mother's, you know. But somehow we've reduced
mm,
a child's life to this feminist slogan.
mm,
Now, no one major political party is blameless in this state of affairs. I think that's important to say. But it's extremely difficult to see how a Labour government is not going to make plight of the unborn child markedly worse. So
mm,
2022, we had 3 in 10 unborn children being killed in the womb. 3 in 10, just let's get our heads around that. What on earth is that statistic going to be at the end of 2029 after
mm,
5 years of potential Labour government?
mm,
These, I think, when we're talking about helping those most in need,
mm,
helping the vulnerable, being on the side of the marginalized, being on the side of justice, of human rights. These are the sort of statistics, these are the sort of issues I think we seriously have to consider when we come to cast our votes Thursday.
mm, Thank you, Tim. That's a helpful intro, and I think what you mentioned there about the brand, almost as it were, the brand that Labour traditionally has of being the party for the working class or the party that's for equality, for those on the margins, for the vulnerable. That's certainly how they would like to be seen, and it's how many people still see them. And for whatever reason, it seems very hard to shake a bad reputation or to shed a good one, on certain issues. It's it seems to stick, and I think what we see with every party, of course, is no one says we're the party that's going to ruin you and make you poorer. Yeah, everyone claims to be the party that's going to bring prosperity. Everyone claims to be pro equality, pro the vulnerable. They would argue they just got different ways of going about it, and so that's where one of the ways in which one of the places where as Christians especially, we need to examine these claims critically and say, okay, they're claiming to be for the vulnerable, but actually are they? And certainly how one treats the unborn child, I think this is a Mother Teresa quote, isn't it? How one treats the most vulnerable in a society is the measure of that society. And so that it's not just claiming to act in the interests of the most vulnerable, but actually acting in the interests of the most vulnerable. And Labour may not acknowledge the reality of the unborn child as a vulnerable people group, but we know, in the light of God's word, we know that they are. They do classify as persons, they classify as a people group. They are definitely the most vulnerable. They literally cannot speak for themselves. They literally cannot defend themselves. They have no way to represent their own interests at all. There's no doubt, there's no question, they are the most vulnerable. And so, how a party is sort of preparing to treat that people group should be front and central as we go to vote. And so we have to look at these things critically and not just accept these claims. Well, we're the compassionate party or we're for the vulnerable. Um, before we kind of dive back into some of the stuff you raised there about Labour in its current iteration and their attitudes towards life and stuff, we'll get onto that. I thought it'd be helpful just to hear something of the case being made for Labour by an evangelical in an evangelical publication. So this came to my attention just the other day. Rachel Maskell, who is the MP standing again in York, one of the York constituencies. She's in the Labour Party. She writes this article for Evangelicals Now, one of the major evangelical newspapers in the country. And I thought this was quite interesting because to me, this was an example of that kind of blending of Christian language and Christian values with the Labour Party. That sort of assertion is being made that these things are compatible, they go hand in hand, there's no conflict here. But I thought it'd be helpful just to take a look at this and see if that does actually hold water. So it opens with this: faith comes first, serving Christ in our troubled and broken world is the call, but why intersect with politics? And then fairly swiftly, she goes on to make the case for why Labour. And I think there are two ways, really, that the case is made. One is on the origins of Labour, saying that Labour has this rich history of, we might call it now, levelling up or whatever, but helping the poor, helping the marginalised. She's big on the encouragement of the NHS. And so there's this kind of the history of help is one kind of arm to her argument, and then the other is all these values are Christian values. Serving the poor. These are Christian values. So in terms of what they're trying to do and what they've historically done, it's totally in lockstep. There was one line towards the end of the article. It says, "How do I walk that line between my Christian faith and my political affiliation with Labour? It comes in one word: service." And that's kind of all we get there. We're just meant to sort of accept that Christian service is the same as service within the Labour Party. There's no conflict there. But I wonder if Tim, you could help us actually hear perhaps a new side of the story, a side of the story we haven't heard before, in terms of the origins of the Labour Party and the history, particularly on life issues. It'd be helpful to hear another side of that story. And then I want to look at the nature of Labour today. So, whatever good they may have done historically, do they really care for the most vulnerable today in their current form? So is that all right, Tim? You talk us just through some of the history of Labour, particularly with regard to life issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, again, as we go about this podcast, you know, where I grew up in Bradford, which is kind of the cradle, really, of the Labour movement, was, is, probably always will be a very working class city, albeit post-industrial now. Um, and in recent times, with the exception of a little bit of a flirtation with George Galloway's Respect Party, has been, kind of solidly Labour. You can always count on Bradford to return Labour MPs. So that's kind of my, just personally, my sort of background. And I would say there's a huge amount actually of value in the heritage of Labour. One might, you've sort of alluded to the sort of working class solidarity. We might talk about trade unionism. I can never say that. Welfare state, the NHS. Historically, this is going back a long time now, but historically, there's also been a kind of history, I suppose, of um, the Tory party might have been labelled as the Church of England at prayer. Labour probably tracked more closely with non-conformity, Methodists, Baptists, URC, that kind of thing. Many Christians who believed that Labour was, addressing some of these concerns for the poor and all the rest of it. So, by no means do I want to dismiss that, But I think we also need to recognise, another side to the story that goes right back to the origins of sort of labour movement and sort of socialism more generally, I suppose, which is there has been this affiliation with the pro-abortion cause that goes right back to the early 20th century and even kind of the end of the 19th century, really. That it tends to be those with strongly left-wing leanings, social radicals, um, those who kind of feel that the church is part of the sort of oppressive system, really, that needs to be dismantled. Those folks have often also been the ones who have been most pushing the abortion cause, and we've done whole podcasts on, for example, the likes of Stella Brown, who was critical in the Abortion Law Reform Association. I mean, she is a very much a feminist. I mean, she would, I think, quite easily walk into any sort of 21st century feminist gathering. She was in many ways ahead of her time, even though I think her ideas were very dangerous. But so she would have been one of those who really, she was at times involved with the Communist Party, actually, so even more to the left of the Labour Party. I think she thought the Labour Party was not sort of left wing enough, basically. But she would be someone who combined very much that sort of real strong socialist tendency with this strong desire to um, see women entitled to abortion and seeing that as part of their rights and as something where probably the state, the church, had hitherto oppressed them and not allowed them those rights, perhaps against also a background where some of the more privileged classes were accessing abortion in whatever fashion. Um, so if you go right back to the sort of early 20th century, you see that going on. Um, the early kind of conventions to discuss abortion, to discuss reproductive issues, were very strongly attended by those on the more radical, politically left sort of part of the spectrum. Then, if you kind of fast forward several years, because I think Stella Brown herself, I think she died mid 20th century. She died, before the Abortion Act itself was passed in '67. Now, of course, David Steele, whose bill it was that made abortion legal in this country in 1967, he of course was a Liberal MP. Of course, he also claimed to be a Christian, but it was under a Labour administration. So Labour came to power, and I think that was a vital sort of tipping point in helping that abortion legislation pass. I'm not sure it would have passed otherwise, certainly with the kind of relative ease with which it did. So there is a history there. There is a backstory involving, certainly sections of the Labour Party's support for abortion, and I guess chafing against a more Judeo-Christian worldview, a more Judeo-Christian sort of morality, and set of values around the family. Um, People might be thinking, well, what has any of this got to do with 2024? Well, if we look at, as I say, the current sort of manifestation of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, who of course has worked very hard to present himself as a moderate, centrist candidate, a sort of avuncular figure that you can trust and feel, we're in safe hands under Mr. Starmer. I think the thing to say about the shadow Labour cabinet, obviously they haven't been elected yet. We don't know what the government's going to look like if a Labour government is elected, but the current shadow Labour cabinet has not one single pro-life representative among them. So we often say that none of the main political parties are consistently pro-life, which is correct. And the last 13 or whatever years of Tory rule, we've seen all sorts of dire things, legislation passed. But I would say there is still a lot more diversity in the Conservative Party. I think the pro-life position is certainly tolerated a lot more than it is within the Labour camp. Um, to take one example, the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, who self-identifies as Christian. I mean, his own story involves his mother, sort of pregnant very early in life, and huge pressure for herself to abort. He's only here today because his mother courageously didn't choose to abort, went against that option. Yet he still supports abortion. So even in these situations, there's this kind of very odd, inconsistent, if you like, support for something that ends a human life. The other key thing we've seen, Dave, of course, and if people are familiar with this pod, they'll know, but most of the pro-abortion legislation, the pro-abortion amendments in the last 5-10 years have come from Labour MPs. That's not me smearing Labour, that's just the reality. So Diana Johnson, Rupert Hook, Stella Creasy, these are all Labour MPs. So whether that's Northern Ireland, abortion being imposed on Northern Ireland, whether it's these buffer zones, banning, criminalising offers of help, prayer, even outside abortion centres, or whether it's the desire to decriminalise abortion, which means sort of removing any final safeguards from abortion legislation, essentially leading to a situation where there'll be many, many, many more cases, such as that of Carla and Lily Foster, where a mother decides to kill her child way beyond the gestational limit with these wretched pills pills in the post. You know, these have been sort of pushed hard by Labour, and I think they will say that it's freedom of conscience on this, but how easy it is to be a Labour MP who vocally makes their pro-life position known, I think is a real mute point. I think it's almost non-existent. It's almost, I think the comparison is helpful. It's almost like in the States with the Democrat Party, they have become de facto the party of abortion. And to be a pro-life Democrat, I mean, they do exist, but it's increasingly hard to do that, both ideologically, but also the amount of stick you get from your own party and friends for holding that line makes it almost impossible, almost non-existent. Keir Starmer himself, I think we need to really focus on the personality of Keir Starmer. He again has voted consistently in pro-abortion in votes where that has been an issue. When he was director of public prosecutions, again we've said this before, but it bears repeating, he deemed it rather not in the public interest to investigate these two doctors who've been performing very openly sex-selective abortions. So essentially, killing baby girls because their parents wanted a boy. So again, all this talk about feminism, which we hear, all the kind of narrative about my body, my choice, about women's rights. Well, let's just remind ourselves that the leader of this party didn't think that was an issue, that people could kill their own children simply because they were girls. This is not China, this is not India, this is 21st century Britain. That's not an issue, apparently. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think in Maskell's article, the claim is made, out of this rich history, this direct quote, the most significant advances have been made. She references the NHS, and then she says, tackling the social injustices of our time. And then she goes on to say, creating a society which is the best to grow up and grow old in. And of course, no one could disagree with any of these sentiments, but when you actually compare them with what these people stand for, it's actually worse than a slip up. It's worse than an omission. It's actually calling evil good and good evil. That's actually what's going on here. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so sick, the claim that Labour is going to provide the best place to grow up and grow old in. Why? Because firstly, you've got to escape the gauntlet of the womb, where there's a genocide going on, and Labour wants more than 250,000 babies a year killed. And then, of course, once you start growing old, you've got the next gauntlet of euthanasia and assisted suicide, where people are going to be presenting you with your bills and saying, look, wouldn't it be better if you were gone now? Look how much your family's having to pay out for you. So it's a sick joke to say this is going to be the best place to grow up and grow old. And good luck if you get to grow up at all. And good luck if you grow old without someone putting pressure on you to commit suicide, and they'll help you do it. This is actually the society that Labour is seeking to usher in. It's tackling the social injustices of our time. Well, how about starting with gender abortion? Starmer's not interested. So it's a serious thing to claim to be doing Christian-y stuff, but actually doing the very opposite. And as we read through the pages of scripture, it's very serious when people say peace where there is no peace. And we like to dress things up. It sounds good. We prophesy smooth words. But in fact, what's going on here is very, very sinister. And I think I could concede. I've had some pushback, some feedback from people talking about what we said in previous podcasts, and one person said, God places different people in different places. It's good. It's good that there are different people in different parties and so on. And I think I can agree with that. God may well call you to stand in a very dark place, but your presence there surely should be somewhat subversive or critical, not just going along with everything that's going along. And the thing about this Maskell article is, I'm not seeing any expression of discomfort at the way things are today in Labour. I'm not seeing any sort of acknowledgement that, well, we used to be about this, but now we've got this blind spot. Whatever. It's just a glowing commendation of Labour wholesale. And as I say, that to say it's the best party to grow up and grow old in, and not even mention Labour's plans on assisted suicide and on abortion and so on. I mean, really, we're kind of getting into the territory of what do these words actually mean at all? Are these just platitudes? It sounds nice. Everyone wants a nice country to grow up and grow old in, but it just doesn't marry up to the reality. So we've looked a little bit at how, although it's worth saying, abortion does not feature in this Labour manifesto. It did in 2019. They did include decriminalisation, legalising abortion up till birth. There on this one, for whatever reason, they're silent on abortion. However, the fact that the whole shadow cabinet is pro-abortion, the fact that the likes of Stella Creasy and Diana Johnson, Rupert Huck, these pro-abort zealots will be given only more free reign in the next sitting if Labour wins. So we can see it doesn't bode well, but we have to be clear it's not in the manifesto. But Tim, talk to us a little bit about how what we do know in writing and from people's voting history and so on, but what we do know about the bigger picture here. So Labour's attitudes to life generally, to the human dignity, to other things, because there is something of a package here. They don't just manifestos don't just get plucked out of thin air. They come out of a worldview. They're formed by a family of values and a vision for society. So tell us a bit about the bigger picture here, the sort of package of values and ambitions for human dignity in particular.
Sure. There was one line which was pretty cryptic in the Labour manifesto, but I think y- depending on how you wanted to interpret it, you could see that as a bit of a veiled reference to abortion rights, which was something about promoting women's health or prioritizing women's health. It's pretty vague. It could mean, of course, nothing to do with that. It could be more about cancers affecting women or whatever. But you just begin to be very suspicious when you're reading these documents. So I
Mm.
think that was the one line that some people have picked up on. But yeah, it certainly wasn't as blatant as the 2019 Corbyn manifesto for sure. But I think, yeah, I actually think it's really important that we see the current Labour Party as the broader kind of ideological position that they're inhabiting, really, and that this their views on abortion, it's not a freak, it's part of a much bigger package. I what I would suggest is that, even though you know obviously Starmer is a different kettle of fish than Jeremy Corbyn, I would still say Labour have swung to the left. They have embraced kind of completely cultural Marxism and the ideology around political correctness, around identity politics, around
Mm.
transgenderism, institutional racism, critical race theory, etc., etc. This is kind of what they stand for now. And I would actually say they're largely, a lot of the time, they're out of touch with traditional working class uh, voters, their concerns, and actually they're more socially conservative. And it's kind of this pandering to I would say, metropolitan elite, really, and increasingly ideological and pretty deluded views, really. So my concerns about this potential Labour government is there's going to be no real support for religious freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. I think we're going to see more of this kind of minority activist-led pressure, further eroding Christian values and heritage. And to kind of to sort of look at this, I just want to, for a few minutes, look at this sort of transgenderism debate, because I think that's a helpful, slightly to the side of abortion, but we'll see how it relates to it at the end. But I think it helpfully illustrates where Labour is, and they have been ardent supporters of the trans movement. You know, they want to make changing your gender easier. They want to introduce this draconian conversion therapy legislation, which would further attack the right to pray with someone who is gender confused or also same-sex attracted. And I suppose, you know, once you've banned prayer in one place outside abortion centres, naturally you want to extend that ban to greater and greater number of situations and contexts. Certainly things that are deemed or dubbed hate prayer, as I've seen, praying for someone who's sort of struggling with sexual desires that they don't want themselves. And on this question, you know, what is a woman, which seems a pretty straightforward question, you know, Starmer has just repeatedly dodged and fudged that question. And, you know, pro-abortion Stella Creasy doesn't know either what the answer to that is, which is ironic for people who claim to be great supporters of women's rights. And, you know, the kind of vitriol that is really synonymous with the transgender movement, the transgender activism, is incredible. Yeah, it's hate driven. It's very misogynistic. It routinely targets women. We can think about J.K. Rowling, Kathleen Stock, but even among Labour MPs themselves. The Labour MP for Canterbury is a lady called Rosie Duffield. Now, on most things, she's completely in sync with the Labour Party. She's feminist. She's pro-abortion. But on this question of gender, she would be dubbed gender critical, which in itself is a huge misnomer. What that really means is she's a realist when it comes to gender. She believes that biology, you know, has a big part to play in gender. That you know, you can't just decide one day. You can't just wake up and decide what gender you want to be. Actually, God made you a certain. Well, this is not how she'd phrase it, but you know, God has made us a certain way. God has made us male and female. That goes right back to the beginning of creation. That's how we are. We don't get to decide what gender we are, just as we don't get to decide, you know, what skin color, what height, what eye color we have. Um, but let's hear in her own words what Rosie Duffield says about these matters. And you know, Dave, a little bit of a trigger warning here for our more sensitive viewers or listeners. What I'm about to say is pretty extreme. Okay, so just gear yourselves, steel yourselves for this. This is what Rosie Duffield said. Only women have a cervix. Okay, let me repeat that. Only women have a cervix. So pretty crazy stuff. And this prompted an angry reaction, their favourite sort, from LGBT plus Labour, demanding that Keir Starmer take action. Okay, so they were really unhappy about this. They wanted Keir Starmer to take action at that revelation. Now, I'm not sure Keir has it in his power to change the facts of life. Possibly he could encourage everyone in LGBT plus Labour to do a biology GCSE. I don't know. But this is the level, okay, this is the
Mm.
level of nonsense we're at when someone's stating that women have cervixes is this is deemed hate speech. And because of that and similar things voiced on Twitter, whatever it's called now, she's received so much vitriol, so much. You know, one guy was convicted for death threats against her. Again, it's always men, interestingly. Now, this occurred in 2020 that she made this biological revelation to people, but there's been campaigns to deselect her for Labour MP in Canterbury, to have the whip withdrawn, and many Labour student groups around the country and other left-wing activists have condemned her in the strongest possible terms. She herself has described it as obsessive harassment. You know, simply for saying that men pretending to be women
Mm.
are in fact still men and always will be. And of course, there's often the real issue at large is often use of women's spaces by men, you know, presenting themselves as trans women or whatever. She had virtually no support from her fellow Labour MPs. She had to miss the Labour Party conference. She's not attended recent in-person hustings for reasons of fear. interestingly, she said being part of the Labour Party is like being in an abusive relationship. And again, these are her words. She said that Labour has a woman problem, a woman problem. So has the great Keir Starmer leapt to her defence? Not in the slightest. He has repeatedly distanced himself from her and her comments. Essentially, he's thrown her under the bus to deal with all this herself.
Mm.
Even in light of the Cass report, and of course its damning indictment on some of these gender, reassignment practices, and particularly for children, Keir Starmer still doesn't want to call a spade when it comes to gender and the like. And this is the thing, Dave. If this is how Keir Starmer treats his own MPs, this
Mm.
this is how he treats the people that are going to bring him to power. He's going to get to power to get to Downing Street on their shoulders. If this is how he treats his own MPs, who on all but a few issues agree wholeheartedly with him, well, how is he going to treat those who he disagrees with
Mm.
vehemently on a whole range of issues, such as abortion?
Mm.
Is he going to be sympathetic to traditional Judeo-Christian values and those who hold them, like evangelical Christians? Of course not. Now,
Mm.
I focused on that transgenderism issue to kind of illustrate this, but the overlap with abortion is abundantly clear. On both these things, Labour is rejecting traditional Judeo-Christian worldview. It's imposing its own dualistic view of the body and of sexuality onto the issues, onto society. So gender and biology are seen as essentially social constructs. Feelings always trump physical attributes. Never mind the fact you were born with a penis. If you identify as a woman, you're a woman. So there's a fundamental hatred of the goodness, the givenness of biological reality. As we'd say, as the way God has made human beings, the male female duality that goes right back to Genesis 1 26, 27. So, in the same way, I would say abortion rejects the goodness, the givenness of the human body, the body of the unborn child in this case. It
Mm.
rebrands it as meaningless tissue, as a clump of cells, as a parasite, even to be excised and disposed of. So, again,
Mm.
feelings, in this case, the feelings of the mother involved or her partner or both, feelings towards this vulnerable child trump its bodily integrity, its right to life ultimately. It's
Mm.
my right over my body to do with this child whatever I wish. And anyone who questions that is judgmental, is a bigot, is a misogynist, all the rest of it. We know the names. Actually, anyone sort of questioning this fictive right to abortion is accused of hating women, of despising human rights. And again, bad as the situation is now, I would contend it's only going to get worse under Labour, because it's Labour in the main who have been pushing this agenda, pushing this ideology, pushing this approach to abortion. So in
Mm.
Rosie Duffield's words, if Labour have a woman problem, and I think they do, they also have a huge unborn child problem.
Mm.
Now, you
Mm.
know, I don't know what you'd say, Dave, but we'd probably say we're not prophets or the sons of prophets, but we've seen enough of the caliber of these politicians. We've seen enough of their policies to know what they're about and to know what's coming for our
Mm.
unborn neighbours if they're elected 4th of July.
Mm. Yes, and the Conservative Party, of course, has been pretty useless at stemming the violence, the evil of abortion. It's been under their watch that so much has gone wrong over the last few years. But we'd have to be blind not to see the step change that a Labour government would represent, particularly with regard to free speech. And free speech is a phrase that we're probably getting tired of. We hear it all the time. And the term Orwellian is also bandied about a lot, but it really is very dark when you're not allowed to say certain things, especially when those things are simply true. It's not even that it's an opinion or it's not even well, how crude can you go before the censorship forces come into play legitimately. We're talking about someone saying essentially a woman has a cervix and they end up getting death threats and being thrown under a bus by their own party for saying something true. It wasn't even, and I think anyone who thinks differently should be locked up. there was nothing added to that. It was just a statement of biological fact, and it's a very sinister thing indeed that we could well be moving into a phase in this country's history where you're not even allowed to say things that are biologically accurate and have been established for millennia. That's a serious situation. So yes, there's the view on human dignity, but there's also the utter intolerance of any kind of dissenting opinion or even statement of fact. And a Christian should look at this and see, well, if they're not seeing it on the abortion issue, at least see it on the trans issue or the assisted suicide or the freedom of speech issue. We're seeing, unless the Lord intervenes, if this happens, it's a very dark cloud coming over our nation on all sorts of levels. And again, going back to the article by Rachel Maskell, which paints this very rosy picture of life with Labour. Look at its rich history, and it's all about service. But when you actually look at the reality, it's very dark, and it's worth mentioning as just one example. When you actually look at Rachel Maskell's voting record on abortion, according to Right to Life website, so 9 votes were pro-life, 3 were abstain, and 1 vote was anti-life, according to their kind of metrics. And the one that was anti was the most recent one. Interestingly, the 3 that were actually abstained were to do with being allowed to offer information, prayer, support outside abortion clinics, which very much goes hand in hand with this attitude to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and all the freedoms that we're used to in this country. But now, if Labour decides we don't like that anymore, guess what? You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to stand there. You can't even pray silently in your head. Unfortunately, this professing evangelical Christian abstained from votes on that when we really needed people to stand up. So you've also got to question if someone is within the Labour Party, are they standing against these oppressive sort of trajectories? Are they able to do it, and are they willing to do it? And sadly, what we've seen, at least on the buffer zone thing, is that this particular evangelical hasn't. Again, you go over to Tim Farron, his voting record as a Liberal Democrat, and he's abstained from huge numbers of votes on pro-life issues. And again, he would say he's pro-life, but actually, what does that mean? Does that actually result in a clear stand that looks like something? And so I think, at least 2 things I think we really need to understand, which is the Labour Party as it is today is really dark. And even the Christians within it who say they're standing for Christian values, some of them at least, actually, when we look at the facts, is it really doing anything to mitigate, to kind of work against that general trajectory? There are other Christian MPs we're not looking at in this podcast, but it cannot be enough just to say, as a Christian, it's all about service, and therefore I'm in the Labour Party. We can't just accept that at face value. I just wanted to mention one more thing, Tim, before perhaps handing over to you for any final comments. And I don't know if it goes beyond the remit of today's podcast, but it just something you said right at the beginning was interesting to me. And this kind of speaks to a more holistic Christian vision as to what governments are even meant to be, what the state is for. And perhaps that's something to talk about in more detail another time. But just the idea that that it's the government's job to love my neighbour on my behalf is quite interesting. That when looking at the different options, it's someone who's going to love the vulnerable. And we all agree with loving the vulnerable. But the assumption that it's the government's job to do that is quite interesting. I was speaking with a relative about politics some time ago, and they were saying how the government was, trying to change the temperature of the earth or something, and she's like, and that's what governments are for, that's their job. And I thought, is it really, is that what governments are for, changing the temperature of the earth? Rachel Maskell in her article says our climate melts, and she said it is Labour that will get to the heart of floods and famines, which is interesting. I mean, that's sort of attributing, it's got godlike power to this particular party. But it's just interesting. We've got all these different roles that are put on governments, but in the kind of noise of all of that, we're going to change the weather. We're going to make total economic equality. But in the noise of all that, what's missed is they can't define what a woman is. They won't acknowledge the most vulnerable people group. They are not stemming the shedding of innocent blood. And so, in basic issues of truth and justice, and really, governments are there, to punish evil and to commend what is good. If you can't even define what is good and define what is evil, what are you doing trying to stop floods in Burma or who knows where else when you're not stopping people killing babies in your own nation? What are governments actually for? Perhaps that's a conversation for another time. But again, I think it's something that we shouldn't let just flow over us, that they can make these far-reaching claims about sorting out the climate when they can't even define what a woman is, or they're unwilling to stop the killing of babies. I mean, what are they actually there for? But anyway, Tim, let me hand over to you for any final comments, and we'll wrap it up. Otherwise, we won't get this thing out before July the 4th.
Yes, but I think it's not unrelated, Dave, because I think one of the symptoms of uh, sort of left-wing political movements is the desire for the government to infringe more and more on personal freedoms, on decisions that really should just be personal, be private. You know, more and more it's sort of subcontracted to the state,
Mm,
and you get this huge state apparatus with its tentacles extending into every part of life, of human life. And I think we do need to be aware of that, because if you look, because the interface of that with something like the life issue, well, look at communist China. Up until very recently,
mm,
they took that to the extreme of dictating how many children every married couple should have. You know, so
mm,
once you'd had your one child, if you got pregnant again, then the government pressure and was on you to have an abortion. What a horrific state of affairs. But that is what you get when you combine a contempt for life. China is
mm,
an atheistic, as I say, Marxist kind of ideology, a contempt with life, with this overbearing desire for the state to literally control every single facet of your citizens' lives. Although I think calling them citizens is a bit generous, but so I think the two are
mm,
related, and it is this
mm,
sense of like what you're saying, the government is going to love my neighbour almost for me. It's ironic that where you get to in the end with that kind of system is the state becomes the be all and end all, and
mm,
kind of um, human interactions, sort of those natural way that people interact, voluntary associations, churches, family units, becomes more and more squashed. And so in
mm,
a way, you get this perverse situation where actually the Labour Party begins to look a bit more like Margaret Thatcher, who said there's no such thing as society. And it's like, well, it almost amounts to the same thing, because the state has just replaced everything. The state has replaced the family, the state has replaced the church. The state tells you what to do, what to think. One
mm,
of the things about this conversion therapy is about conversations parents have with children. So the state is intervening and intruding at the most kind of the most fundamental level of human society, of the family unit. Most societies over time, certainly, as I say, the Judeo-Christian model, have understood families, have understood marriage to be the building blocks of society. I mean, I don't think this potential Labour government do at all.
mm,
So I think, Dave, the things are not unrelated. I think
mm,
we're going to see a bigger and bigger state apparatus, less and less room for freedom of expression, freedom of belief. I think personal conscience, personal beliefs on this issue of abortion, whether that's among MPs, whether that's among healthcare professionals, whether that's among teachers, whether that's among, and eventually whether that's among pastors and religious teachers, I think is going to get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So for all those reasons, again, I think we need to be
Mm,
seriously asking ourselves what would this look like in
mm,
reality? What world are we gonna be waking up to on the
mm,
5th of July if this is what the British people have
mm,
returned? So
mm. Thank you, Tim. Well, we better leave it there. But I just want to close with really, in all sincerity, a heartfelt plea that people who have been planning to vote this way, please think again, and please join us in praying against what, in all likelihood, this Labour government would mean for our nation. There are other options. Mercifully, we've talked about those in other podcasts, but please think again and pray that the Lord will spare us some of these dark things we've been talking about today. Thank you for listening, and God bless you. We'll see you on the other side next week.